The colonel's voice cut across the parade ground like a blade through morning fog. "You there, groundskeeper, move your equipment. Now, you're my sight line." The old man in the faded green work shirt didn't flinch. His hands, weathered and scarred across the knuckles, continued their work for exactly 2 more seconds before stopping. Not rushing, not freezing, just finishing the motion with a precision that seemed out of place for someone pushing a wheelbarrow full of hedge trimmings. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. His voice was hoarse, rough from years of disuse. "Moving now, sir." Colonel Bradley Mercer stood at the edge of the ceremonial stage, clipboard in hand, dress uniform pressed to perfection. Behind him, a crew of cadets erected the banner for Harrington Military Academy's 132nd Founders Day celebration. Camera crews from 3 local stations were setting up their equipment. Parents were already arriving, parking their Mercedes and BMWs in the visitor lot. Everything had to be perfect. Everything except the old man with dirt on his boots and grass stains on his knees. Mercer watched the groundskeeper shuffle his wheelbarrow toward the service path with something between contempt and amusement. The old man moved slowly, deliberately, each step measured like he was crossing terrain that might explode beneath him. His work boots were held together with what looked like electrical tape. His canvas pants had been patched so many times they resembled a quilt. A pair of dog tags clinked softly beneath his shirt with each step, barely audible, a sound that meant nothing to the colonel and everything to the man who wore them. What the colonel didn't know, what nobody on that parade ground knew, was that in exactly 4 hours his career would be over, and it would end at the hands of a man he had just dismissed as invisible. Virgil Tate had been invisible for 11 years. 11 years of arriving before dawn, of trimming hedges while cadets jogged past without seeing him, of raking leaves while officers discussed strategy on the walking paths, as if he were furniture. 11 years of tending the memorial garden where the names of fallen graduates were carved into black granite, names that parents touched with trembling fingers while he stood 10 feet away, pruning roses, saying nothing. He preferred it that way. Invisibility was a gift he had earned, a privilege purchased with 56 years of carrying faces in his memory that would never grow old. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we'd love to know where you're joining us from today. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now, let's continue. The sun climbed higher over the Virginia hills, casting long shadows across the parade ground. Virgil guided his wheelbarrow along the service path, feeling the familiar ache in his left knee where the shrapnel had been removed in a field hospital 56 years ago. The doctors had said he would never walk normally again. They had said a lot of things back then, most of them wrong. He passed the VIP tent where the morning's honored guests would gather before the ceremony. White tablecloths, crystal glassware catching the early light, name cards at each place setting, gold embossed with ranks and titles. His name was not among them. His name was not on anything at this academy except the payroll, and even there it was spelled wrong. Virgil Tate, close enough for direct deposit. Close enough for a man who wanted to be forgotten. But as he passed the tent, something made him pause. A feeling he hadn't had in years. The sensation of being watched, not with contempt, but with attention. Sergeant Major Arthur Devane stood at the edge of the tent, coffee cup in hand, watching the old groundskeeper with an expression that shifted between confusion and something deeper. He was 68 years old, retired Marine Corps, current military liaison for the academy. His job was to coordinate between the active duty speakers and the academic administration. His job was not to stare at groundskeepers, and yet he could not look away. Something about the old man's movement, the way he had stopped his wheelbarrow, the angle of his shoulders when the colonel had barked at him, the precise, economical motion of his hands. Devane had seen movement like that before, in another lifetime, in jungles that still invaded his dreams. He shook his head, took a sip of coffee that had gone cold. Coincidence. Muscle memory could come from anywhere. Construction work. farming, 1,000 trades that required precise hands. But his eyes followed the groundskeeper until the old man disappeared around the corner of the administration building, and the coffee cup trembled slightly in his grip. Across the parade ground, Colonel Mercer had already forgotten the encounter. He was reviewing his keynote speech for the 14th time, marking passages where he would pause for effect, where he would let his voice crack with manufactured emotion about sacrifice and duty. He had never seen combat. His deployments had been to air-conditioned offices in Germany and administrative posts in Japan. But he had mastered the language of war, the cadence of heroism, the vocabulary that made parents weep and donors open their checkbooks. He would speak today about the warrior spirit, about the sacred bond between those who serve, about honor earned in blood. And he would do it 20 feet from a man whose hands had carried 3 bodies through 2 miles of enemy jungle, whose blood type was tattooed on his chest next to coordinates that had been classified for 30 years, whose call sign was still whispered in force recon communities from Camp Pendleton to Camp Lejeune. The colonel would speak about sacrifice, and he would never know that sacrifice was trimming the hedges behind the stage, asking for nothing, remembered by no one, exactly the way he wanted it. Virgil reached the equipment shed and began unloading his wheelbarrow. The ceremony preparations would continue for another 3 hours. Then the speeches. Then the parade of cadets in their dress uniforms, young faces shining with ambition and certainty. He would watch from the perimeter, as he always did. He would stand at attention when the flag was raised, as he always did. And when the ceremony ended, he would return to work, invisible again, grateful for the silence. What he did not know was that today would be different. Today was January 30th, the anniversary, and somewhere in the universe of coincidence and fate, the colonel's hand would close around Virgil's arm at exactly the wrong moment. His sleeve would ride up at exactly the wrong angle, and a tattoo that had been hidden for decades would finally see the light. 3 initials, DR, MWTG. 3 men who had died in his arms. 3 brothers he had carried home. The morning light caught the edge of the memorial garden, where roses he had planted 11 years ago were just beginning to bloom. Red for courage, white for sacrifice, yellow for remembrance. He had chosen each color deliberately. He had tended each plant like a grave, because that's what they were. Graves for men whose bodies had come home, but whose spirits, he believed, had stayed in the jungle with him. Waiting, watching, wondering when he would finally stop running. Virgil touched the dog tags beneath his shirt. 2 sets, his own and the ones that had belonged to Danny Reeves. The ones he had pulled from his best friend's chest as the life drained from his eyes. The ones that were worn smooth now from 56 years of being touched in the dark. Still here, brother, he whispered. Still trying. The words were the same ones he spoke every morning. The same ones he would speak every morning until the day he died. A promise made in a jungle clearing while tracers lit the sky. A promise he would keep until his last breath. He closed the shed door and walked back toward the parade ground. The colonel was gesturing broadly at something, his voice carrying across the grass, barking orders at cadets who moved with nervous precision. Sergeant Major Devane was still standing at the edge of the VIP tent, coffee cup forgotten in his hand, eyes scanning the grounds with an intensity that had nothing to do with ceremony security. And Cadet First Class Elena Vasquez was adjusting her phone on a tripod near the memorial garden, preparing to record the day's events for the Academy's social media channels. She noticed the old groundskeeper passing by and did something no one else at the Academy had done in 11 years. She nodded at him, just a small movement, an acknowledgement that he existed. Virgil stopped. For just a moment, his mask slipped. Something flickered in his eyes that might have been surprise, might have been gratitude, might have been the memory of a time when people saw him as a person instead of function. Then the mask returned, and he nodded back and continued walking toward the hedge line where his pruning shears waited. The day had only just begun, and everything was about to change. For hours earlier, before the sun had crested the Virginia hills, before the colonel had arrived in his polished staff car, before the world remembered that Harrington Military Academy existed, Virgil Tate had been alone with the dead. He arrived at 4:30 every morning. The same time, the same routine. 11 years of repetition had worn grooves into his life as deep as the lines in his face. He parked his rusted pickup truck in the maintenance lot, the engine ticking as it cooled, and sat for exactly 3 minutes in the darkness, breathing, preparing, becoming the man he needed to be for another day of invisibility. The photograph lived in the glove box. He pulled it out as he did every morning, holding it up to catch the faint glow of the dashboard clock. 5 faces stared back at him from another lifetime. Young faces, unbroken faces, faces that still believed they would grow old together, raise families together, tell war stories at reunions where they would laugh about the time Martinez stepped on a snake and screamed louder than any enemy contact. Martinez, Webb, Garza, Reeves, and in the center, a young man with hard eyes and a jaw set like granite, barely recognizable as the weathered groundskeeper who held the photograph now. Operation Phantom Strike, January 1968. The 5 of them had been inserted behind enemy lines to extract a captured intelligence officer. A simple mission, in and out, 48 hours maximum. It had taken 9 days, and only one of them had walked out. Virgil traced his finger across Danny Reeves' face. Danny had been point man, the best Virgil had ever seen. Could read a jungle trail like sheet music, anticipate ambush positions before they materialized, move through vegetation without disturbing a single leaf. Danny had been the one who taught Virgil that silence was not the absence of sound but the presence of attention. That invisibility was not about being unseen, but about being unremarkable. Danny had been 23 years old when the bullet found him. 23 years old and still believing that skill could defeat chance, that being the best meant surviving. The extraction had gone wrong on the 7th day. They had the intelligence officer. They were 2 miles from the pickup zone. And then the jungle had exploded with gunfire from 3 directions, and Danny had taken a round that was meant for Virgil, and everything after that was a blur of muzzle flash and screaming and the weight of bodies that grew heavier with every step. Virgil slid the photograph back into the glove box and stepped out of the truck. The morning air was cold, carrying the scent of dew-soaked grass and the distant promise of spring. He walked the familiar path to the equipment shed, unlocked the padlock with a key worn smooth from use, and gathered his tools for the day. The memorial garden waited. It was the only part of his job that mattered to him. The rest was just motion, just time passing, just a reason to wake up in the morning when the alternative seemed so much simpler. But the memorial garden was sacred. The memorial garden was where he performed the only ritual that kept him tethered to the world of the living. He walked past the black granite walls where names of fallen academy graduates were carved in precise rows. Class of 1943. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Young men and women who had walked these grounds with ambition and certainty before the world taught them that certainty was a luxury the dead could not afford. But Virgil did not stop at the granite walls. He walked past them to a corner of the garden that no one else visited. A corner where 3 rose bushes grew in a small triangle, their thorns sharp and their blooms not yet open in the January cold. He knelt in the dirt, his bad knee protesting with a familiar ache, and pulled a small folding knife from his pocket. The knife had been Danny's. Virgil had carried it for 56 years. He used it now to trim the dead growth from the rose bushes, to clear the weeds that threatened to choke the roots, to tend the only grave his brothers would ever have. The names on his arm matched the pattern of the bushes. DR on the left, MW in the center, TG on the right. Danny, Marcus, Thomas, 3 men who had followed him into the jungle and never followed him out. "Morning, boys," he said quietly. His voice was barely above a whisper, cracked and rough, speaking words he had spoken 10,000 times before. "Made it through another night. Thought you should know." He worked in silence for several minutes, his hands moving with the same precision he had used to field strip a rifle in the dark, to apply a pressure bandage while under fire, to carry a body through 2 miles of enemy territory without making sound. The roses would bloom in April. Red for Danny, who had bled out in his arms. White for Marcus, who had taken 3 rounds to the chest and still managed to return fire until his magazine was empty. Yellow for Tomas, who had been 19 years old and so scared and so brave, who had thrown himself on a grenade that turned out to be a dud, who had died anyway from the sniper round that found him 30 seconds later. Virgil finished his work and stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. The sun was beginning to show above the hills now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It would be a beautiful day for a ceremony. A beautiful day for speeches about sacrifice and honor and the warrior spirit. He reached beneath his shirt and pulled out the dog tags. 2 sets. His own, with the information that identified him as property of the United States Marine Corps, and Danny's, with the blood type and religious preference of a man who had believed in nothing except the brother standing next to him. The tags were warm from his skin. He held them for a moment, feeling the weight of metal and memory, before tucking them back beneath his shirt. There was a book in his back pocket. Marcus Aurelius. Meditations. The spine was cracked, the pages yellowed, the cover held together with tape that he replaced every few months. His commanding officer had given it to him before the insertion. Read it when the jungle gets loud, the colonel had said. It will remind you that everything passes. Even this. Virgil had read it 1,000 times since then. He had memorized passages that he recited in the dark when the faces came too close. He had underlined sentences that felt like truth, like the only truth that mattered in a world that had taken everything from him except the burden of continuing. He pulled the book out now and opened it to a random page. His eyes found a passage he had read so many times the words were burned into his memory. Never value anything as profitable that compels you to break your promise. Lose your self-respect. Hate any man, suspect, curse, act the hypocrite, or desire anything that needs walls or curtains. He closed the book and returned it to his pocket. The walls he had built around himself were invisible. The curtains he hid behind were made of dirt and silence, and the carefully constructed performance of being no one. He had not broken his promise to Danny. He was still here, still trying, still carrying them forward one day at a time. The sound of vehicles on the main drive pulled him back to the present. The ceremony preparations were beginning. The colonel would arrive soon, and the cadets would march, and the speeches would echo across grounds that Virgil had tended with his own hands, his own sweat, his own silent penance. He gathered his tools and walked toward the hedge line near the parade ground. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And as long as there was work, he could avoid thinking about the weight of the photograph in the glove box, the weight of the tags against his chest, the weight of 3 bodies he had carried through the jungle and had been carrying ever since. The sun rose higher. The day moved forward, and Virgil Tate became invisible again, exactly the way he wanted it, exactly the way he needed it, until the moment when a colonel's hand would close around his arm and tear away everything he had built. But that moment was still hours away. For now, there was only the hedge and the shears and the steady rhythm of work that asked nothing of him except his presence. For now, there was only survival. The same survival he had practiced for 56 years. The only thing he knew how to do anymore. The colonel found him again at 9:45. Virgil was trimming the boxwood hedge behind the ceremonial stage, his shears moving in steady rhythm, when the shadow fell across his work. He did not need to look up to know who it was. The polished boots alone told the story. Boots that had never seen mud, never felt the suction of jungle floor, never been held together with tape and prayer while their owner carried the dead through hostile territory. "You again," Colonel Mercer said. His voice carried the theatrical projection of a man accustomed to audiences. "Did I not make myself clear earlier?" Virgil stopped his work and straightened slowly. His back protested, his knee ached, and somewhere beneath his ribs the old shrapnel wound pulsed with a dull heat that always intensified when his body tensed. He kept his eyes down, his posture neutral, his voice soft. "Apologies, sir. Finishing the trim work. We'll be out of your way shortly." Shortly is not acceptable. Mercer stepped closer, and Virgil could smell the cologne, something expensive and aggressive that seemed designed to announce presence rather than compliment it. "Do you have any idea what is happening here today?" Do you have any concept of the importance of this ceremony? Yes, sir. Founders Day, sir. Founders Day. Mercer repeated the words with contempt, as if Virgil had somehow diminished them by speaking them aloud. We have a United States Senator arriving in 2 hours. We have the Commandant of the Marine Corps sending a personal representative. We have cameras, donors, parents of cadets who pay $60,000 a year to attend this institution. And you're squatting behind my stage with your little scissors, looking like you crawled out of a drainage ditch. A cluster of cadets had stopped their work nearby. They were supposed to be arranging chairs for the VIP section, but the colonel's voice had drawn their attention like a flare in darkness. 6 young faces watched the confrontation, some with discomfort, others with the blank expressions of those who had learned that witnessing cruelty was safer than acknowledging it. Among them stood Cadet First Class Elena Vasquez. She had paused with a chair in her hands, her eyes moving between the colonel and the groundskeeper with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something the others missed. The old man's hands, the way they remained perfectly still at his sides, the way his weight had shifted almost imperceptibly onto the balls of his feet, the way his shoulders had squared without appearing to move at all. She had seen that posture before, in training videos, in footage of operators preparing for insertion, in the way her grandfather, a retired Army Ranger, had stood whenever someone raised their voice in his presence. Something is wrong with this picture, she thought. Something does not add up. The colonel continued his performance. Look at yourself. Mercer gestured broadly, ensuring the cadets could see every movement. Dirt on your clothes. Stains on your boots. You smell like fertilizer and failure. This is a military institution. We have standards. We have dignity. And you are an embarrassment to both. Virgil said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere past the colonel's left shoulder, focused on nothing and everything simultaneously. The 1,000-yard stare that men who had seen too much learned to deploy as armor. Do you understand me? Mercer demanded. He was growing frustrated now. The lack of reaction was denying him the satisfaction he craved. The groundskeeper was supposed to stammer, to apologize, to shrink beneath the weight of superior rank and righteous criticism. Instead, the old man simply stood there, absorbing the assault like a stone absorbing rain. Yes, sir, Virgil said quietly. I understand, sir. Then why are you still standing here? Move, get your equipment, and get out of my sight. And do not let me see you anywhere near this stage until the ceremony is over. Am I clear? Crystal clear, sir. Virgil bent to gather his shears and the small bucket of trimmings. His movements were deliberate and unhurried, each action completed with an economy of motion that seemed almost choreographed. The colonel watched with mounting irritation, waiting for a fumble, a dropped tool, some evidence of the incompetence he had decided existed. None came. As Virgil rose with his equipment, something flickered in the colonel's expression. A momentary confusion, quickly suppressed. The groundskeeper moved like no groundskeeper the colonel had ever seen. There was something beneath the worn clothes and weathered skin that contradicted the narrative of failure and disgrace. Something that made the colonel's certainty waver for just a fraction of a second. Then the moment passed, and Mercer turned on his heel and strode back toward the stage, already barking orders at the cadets who had witnessed the exchange. The show was over. The help had been put in its place. The natural order of the military universe had been restored. But Cadet Vasquez did not move. She watched the old groundskeeper walk slowly toward the service path, his bucket in one hand, his shears in the other. She watched the way he carried himself despite the weight of public humiliation. She watched the slight bulge beneath his work shirt where something hung on a chain around his neck. And she watched Sergeant Major Arthur Devane, who had emerged from the VIP tent during the confrontation and now stood frozen at its entrance, his coffee cup forgotten in his hand, his eyes locked on the retreating figure of the groundskeeper with an expression that looked almost like fear. Something is very wrong with this picture, Vasquez thought again, and she made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and opened the camera app. She had been assigned to record the ceremony for the Academy's social media channels. That was her official duty. But the ceremony was still hours away, and something told her that the real story was not going to happen on the stage. She kept the groundskeeper in frame as he disappeared around the corner of the administration building, then turned her lens towards Sergeant Major Devane. The old Marine had not moved. His lips were moving slightly, forming a word that Vasquez could not hear from this distance. A word that seemed to drain the color from his weathered face. At the edge of the parade ground, hidden from view behind the equipment shed, Virgil set down his tools and leaned against the wall. His hand was shaking now, not from fear, not from anger, from the effort of containment, from the energy required to remain invisible when every instinct screamed for him to respond, to stand, to become the man he had once been. He reached beneath his shirt and gripped the dog tags until the metal edges bit into his palm. The pain grounded him. The pain reminded him who he was now. Not the legend, not the warrior, just an old man with dirt on his clothes and ghosts in his head, trying to survive another day. But today was January 30th. Today was the anniversary of the day he had carried Danny Reeves' body through 2 miles of jungle while his best friend's blood soaked through his uniform and dripped on leaves that would never remember what had happened beneath them. Today, something inside him was beginning to crack. And somewhere across the parade ground, a sergeant major who had studied the legends of Force Recon was beginning to remember a call sign that had been whispered in reverence for 30 years. Spectre, the ghost who carried his brothers home. The helicopter came in low over the tree line at 11:15. It was a ceremonial flyover, a UH-60 Black Hawk from the National Guard unit based 40 miles south, scheduled to pass over the parade ground precisely as the color guard took their positions. A dramatic touch, a crowd pleaser, the kind of choreographed moment that looked beautiful in photographs and promotional videos. But Virgil did not see a Black Hawk. He saw a Huey, green and scarred and trailing smoke from a hit it had taken 30 seconds earlier. He saw the door gunner waving frantically, pointing toward the landing zone that was too hot, too exposed, too far from where 3 bodies lay waiting to be carried home. The rotor wash hit him like a wall of memory. The sound of the blades chopped through the January air and reached into his chest and pulled out something that had been buried for 56 years. His hand stopped moving. His shears fell to the grass. And for a moment, he was not standing behind the administration building at Harrington Military Academy. He was standing in a jungle clearing in Quang Tri Province, watching Danny Reeves bleed out in the elephant grass. The extraction had been scheduled for dawn. Simple pickup, for minutes on the ground maximum. They had the intelligence officer, a thin man with hollow eyes who had spent 3 weeks in enemy hands and no longer flinched at anything. They had covered 16 miles through hostile territory in 7 days, moving only at night, surviving on rainwater and cold rice, and the absolute certainty that failure was not an option. Marcus Webb had been on point when the first shots came. He went down before anyone could react. 3 rounds stitching across his chest in a pattern that Virgil would see every time he closed his eyes for the rest of his life. Marcus had been 25 years old. He had a daughter back home he had never met, born 3 days after deployment. He had carried her photograph in his helmet liner, protected by plastic wrap, touched every night before sleep like a prayer. Tomas Garza died 45 seconds later. The kid had been 19, so young he still wrote letters to his mother every week, still believed that God watched over good men in bad places, still thought that bravery was a shield instead of just a choice. When the grenade landed 5 feet from the intelligence officer, Tomas had thrown himself on it without hesitation. The grenade was a dud. The sniper round that found Tomas 30 seconds later was not. And Danny had been standing next to Virgil when the RPG came screaming out of the tree line. Danny had seen it before Virgil did. Danny had shoved Virgil sideways, taking the position that should have been his, absorbing the shrapnel that should have torn through Virgil's chest instead. 90 seconds. That was how long it took for Danny to die. 90 seconds of holding pressure on wounds that could not be held, of whispering promises that could not be kept, of watching the light fade from eyes that had seen Virgil through 3 deployments and 2 marriages and 1 long night in a Saigon bar, when Virgil had wanted to eat his service pistol and Danny had talked him back from the edge. "You get them home, Spectre." Danny's voice had been barely a whisper, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "Promise me, you get them home." The helicopter had extracted them 6 hours later. By then, Virgil had carried all 3 bodies to the pickup zone, 2 miles through terrain that was still crawling with enemy patrols. He had moved in absolute silence, his brothers across his shoulders, their blood soaking through his uniform until he could not tell where their wounds ended and his began. The after-action report called it extraordinary heroism under fire. The classified commendation spoke of single-handed extraction of fallen teammates while wounded and under pursuit. The Silver Star citation mentioned courage beyond the call of duty. None of it mentioned the truth. That Virgil had not been brave, that he had simply been unable to leave them behind, that the weight of their bodies was nothing compared to the weight of surviving when they did not. The Black Hawk passed overhead and continued south, its ceremonial mission complete. The sound of the rotors faded into the Virginia sky, replaced by the rustle of wind through winter-bare branches and the distant murmur of ceremony preparations. Virgil blinked. The jungle dissolved. The elephant grass became trimmed boxwood. The blood on his hands became dirt and grass stains. He was standing behind the administration building at Harrington Military Academy, and his shears were lying on the ground, and his breath was coming in short, ragged gasps that he could not control. 56 years. 56 years since he had carried them home. And some days, most days, he could hold the memory at arm's length, could function through the hours by focusing on hedges and roses and the simple rhythm of physical labor. But today was the anniversary. Today the walls were thin. Today the ghosts were close. He picked up his shears with hands that trembled and would not stop trembling. He pressed his palm against the dog tags beneath his shirt, feeling the familiar edges, the worn engravings, the warmth of metal that had been against his skin for more than half a century. "Still here, brother," he whispered, still trying. But his voice cracked on the words, and for the first time in years, he was not certain they were true. Across the parade ground, the ceremony preparations continued. Cadets arranged chairs with military precision. The color guard rehearsed their approach to the flagpole. Colonel Mercer reviewed his speech one final time, practicing the pauses where he would let his voice tremble with manufactured emotion. And Sergeant Major Arthur Devane stood at the edge of the VIP tent, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone at Marine Corps Historical Division. "I need records," he said. "Operation Phantom Strike, January 1968. Quanti Hovin." There was a team. Force Recon. Call sign Spectre was the team leader. He listened, his face growing paler with each word from the other end of the line. "I know it is classified," he said. "I know it has been 50 years. But I need to know who survived. I need to know if he could still be alive." The answer came, and Devane's hand began to shake so badly he nearly dropped the phone. "One survivor," the voice on the other end confirmed. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Virgil Tate. Silver Star. Navy Cross. 2 Purple Hearts. Retired 1989. Current whereabouts unknown." But Devane knew. Standing in the January sunshine, watching an old groundskeeper disappear around the corner of the administration building, Sergeant Major Arthur Devane knew exactly where Master Gunnery Sergeant Virgil Tate had been hiding for the past 11 years. And he knew that before this day was over, the colonel who had just humiliated a living legend was going to learn what those words really meant. The ceremony began at noon with the precision of a military operation. The color guard advanced across the parade ground in perfect formation, their footsteps synchronized to the beat of a drum cadence that echoed off the stone buildings. Parents filled the viewing stands, cameras raised, faces glowing with pride. Donors in expensive suits clustered near the VIP tent, sipping champagne and discussing tax deductions. The senator's motorcade had arrived 20 minutes earlier, black SUVs disgorging staffers and security personnel who now lined the perimeter like decorative sentinels. And at the edge of it all, invisible as always, Virgil Tate stood at attention. He had positioned himself near the memorial garden, far enough from the stage to avoid another confrontation with the colonel, close enough to see the flag when it was raised. His tools lay at his feet, abandoned for the duration of the ceremony. His hands hung at his sides, fingers slightly curled, weight balanced evenly on both feet. His eyes were fixed on the flagpole. When the national anthem began, something shifted in his posture. The stoop disappeared. The weariness lifted from his shoulders like fog burning off in morning sun. For 2 minutes and 30 seconds, the old groundskeeper became someone else entirely. Someone whose spine was steel. Someone whose bearing spoke of decades of service. Someone who had stood at attention in places that would never appear on any map. Cadet Vasquez noticed. She was stationed near the media platform, her phone still recording, her attention split between the official ceremony and the old man standing alone at the garden's edge. When the anthem began, she had zoomed in on his face almost by instinct. What she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. His lips were moving, not singing. Something else. Something that looked like names. She could not hear the words, but she could see the tears that tracked silently down his weathered cheeks. Could see the way his right hand trembled at his side, before clenching into a fist so tight the knuckles went white. Could see the moment when the anthem ended and the old man seemed to deflate, the invisible weight settling back onto his shoulders, the stoop returning, the legend retreating behind the mask of the groundskeeper. "Who are you?" she whispered to herself. "What did they do to you?" Across the parade ground, Sergeant Major Devane was asking himself the same question. He stood at the back of the VIP tent, ignoring the champagne, ignoring the small talk, ignoring the senator's chief of staff who kept trying to discuss appropriations for military academies. His eyes were fixed on the same figure Vasquez was watching. His mind was racing through memories of training lectures, historical briefings, the stories that were passed down from one generation of Marines to the next like sacred texts. Operation Phantom Strike had been classified for 30 years. When the files were finally declassified in 1998, most of the operational details had been redacted. But the stories had survived. The legend of a force recon team that had been inserted behind enemy lines during the Tet Offensive. The legend of an extraction that went catastrophically wrong. The legend of a single operator who had carried 3 fallen teammates through 2 miles of hostile jungle while wounded and under pursuit. The legend of Spectre. Devane had been a young corporal in 1968, still in training when Phantom Strike occurred. He had never served with the legendary team, but he had heard the stories. Every Marine who served in Vietnam had heard the stories. And when he saw the way the old groundskeeper stood at attention during the anthem, when he recognized the bearing and the precision and the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen things that could never be unseen, the stories had come flooding back. He should do something. He should walk across the parade ground and confirm his suspicions. He should tell the colonel what he had done. He should alert the senator, the commandant's representative, the cameras that were recording every moment of this ceremony. But something held him back. Something in the way the old man had positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, invisible and alone, suggested that anonymity was not an accident. The legend did not want to be found. The ghost wanted to remain a ghost. And who was Arthur Devane to deny a living legend his peace? The ceremony continued. Colonel Mercer took the stage to thunderous applause, his dress uniform gleaming in the midday sun. He gripped the podium with both hands, surveyed the crowd with practiced gravitas, and began to speak about sacrifice. "Today we honor those who came before us," he said, his voice carrying across the parade ground with rehearsed emotion. "Those who gave everything so that we might stand here in freedom. Those who answered the call when their nation needed them most." At the edge of the memorial garden, Virgil's jaw tightened. His eyes remained fixed on the flag, but his attention was on the words pouring from the stage like honey poured over broken glass. "Sacrifice is not a word," Mercer continued. "It is an action. It is the choice to put duty above self, country above comfort, mission above survival. It is what separates the warrior from the civilian, the hero from the bystander." Virgil's hand moved to his chest, pressing against the dog tags beneath his shirt. Danny's tags. The metal edges bit into his palm. And today, We commit ourselves to honoring that sacrifice, not with words alone, but with deeds, with service, with the unbreakable bond that connects all who have worn the uniform. The crowd applauded. Parents wiped tears from their eyes. Cadets stood straighter, chins lifted, shoulders squared. The senator nodded approvingly, already calculating how many votes this photo opportunity would generate. And at the edge of the memorial garden, a man who had carried 3 bodies through enemy jungle felt something inside him beginning to crack. It was not anger. Anger was too simple, too clean. It was something older and deeper, something that had been buried beneath 11 years of invisibility and 56 years of silence. It was the weight of listening to men who had never bled speak about bleeding. The weight of watching uniforms that had never been torn by shrapnel gleam in sunlight that fell equally on the living and the dead. He should leave. He knew he should leave. The ceremony would continue for another hour. The colonel would finish his speech. The cadets would march. The flag would be lowered and folded and presented to some dignitary who would accept it with rehearsed solemnity. And Virgil could return to his roses, his hedges, his invisible life. But his feet would not move. Today was January 30th. Today was the anniversary. And somewhere beneath the layers of dirt and silence and carefully constructed anonymity, something was stirring. Something that had been asleep for a very long time. Something that remembered what sacrifice really meant. Sergeant Major Devane watched the old groundskeeper from across the parade ground, seeing the tension in his shoulders, the stillness that was not peace but containment. He watched a man who had every right to walk away, choose to stay. He watched a legend standing in the shadow of men who did not deserve to speak his name. And he made a decision. Whatever happened next, he would not let the ghost remain invisible forever. Some stories were too important to be forgotten. Some sacrifices were too great to be buried beneath 11 years of trimmed hedges and tended roses. Before this day was over, the world would know who was standing at the edge of that garden. Before this day was over, Spectre would come home. The speech ended to applause that rolled across the parade ground like distant thunder. Colonel Mercer stepped back from the podium, basking in the adulation, shaking hands with the senator, accepting congratulations from the commandant's representative. He had delivered his finest performance. The pauses had landed perfectly. The voice cracks had drawn tears. The standing ovation had lasted nearly a full minute. He was riding that high when he spotted the groundskeeper. The old man had not moved from his position near the memorial garden. He stood like a statue at the edge of the celebration, still as stone, watching the proceedings with an expression that Mercer could not quite read. It might have been grief. It might have been contempt. It might have been nothing at all, just the vacant stare of a man too simple to understand what he was witnessing. But something about that stillness irritated the colonel. Something about the old man's presence at the periphery of his triumph felt like a stain on an otherwise perfect canvas. Mercer excused himself from the VIP cluster and began walking toward the memorial garden. He did not know exactly what he intended to do. Perhaps another warning. Perhaps a more forceful removal. Perhaps simply the satisfaction of exercising power over someone who could not resist. Sergeant Major Devane saw the colonel moving and felt his stomach drop. No, he whispered. Not now. Not like this. He began pushing through the crowd, but the VIP tent was packed with donors and dignitaries, and every step required an apology, an excuse, a moment of social navigation that cost precious seconds. By the time he reached the edge of the tent, Mercer was already halfway to the garden. Cadet Vasquez saw it too. She had been reviewing her footage when movement caught her eye, and now she watched the colonel striding across the grass with the purposeful gait of a predator approaching wounded prey. Her thumb found the record button without conscious thought. Whatever was about to happen, she was going to capture it. Virgil saw the colonel coming and felt nothing. That was the strangest part. All morning, he had been fighting to contain the memories, struggling to hold the walls in place, trembling with the effort of remaining invisible. But now, watching the polished boots approach across the manicured grass, he felt only a vast and empty calm. Perhaps the walls had already fallen. Perhaps there was nothing left to protect. Perhaps 56 years of carrying the dead had finally worn through whatever barrier had separated the legend from Groundskeeper. He did not move. He did not look away. He simply waited. "I thought I told you to stay out of sight," Mercer said. His voice was lower now, no longer performing for an audience, but the contempt remained. "The ceremony is not over. We have photographs, receptions, formal presentations. And you're standing here like a scarecrow, ruining the aesthetic of my event." "Your event," Virgil repeated. The words came out flat, without inflection. Just an observation. Something flickered in Mercer's eyes. The response was not what he expected. Groundskeepers did not repeat words back to colonels. Groundskeepers apologized and shuffled away and returned to their invisible tasks. "Excuse me?" Virgil said nothing. His eyes had moved past the colonel to the flag that still flew above the parade ground, snapping in a January wind. "I asked you a question," Mercer pressed. He stepped closer, close enough that Virgil could see the vein pulsing in his temple, the flush creeping up his neck. "Are you deaf as well as incompetent?" "No, sir," Virgil said quietly. "I hear you fine. Then answer me. What gives you the right to stand here during my ceremony, looking like you just crawled out of a foxhole?" The word hit Virgil like a physical blow. Foxhole. A word the colonel had never earned. A word that belonged to men who had dug into foreign soil with their bare hands, who had pressed their bodies against the earth while death screamed overhead, who had crawled through mud and blood and darkness to reach brothers who were already gone. The calm cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. "I served," Virgil said. The words were barely above a whisper, but something in them made Mercer take a half step back. "I earned the right to stand wherever I choose." Mercer recovered quickly. His lip curled into a sneer. "You served. Of course you did. Every homeless veteran claims they served. Every drunk at the VA claims they were special forces. You want to know how many times I have heard that story?" Behind Mercer, still 50 yards away and fighting through the crowd, Sergeant Major Devane saw the exchange and began to run. Vasquez zoomed in, her phone steady despite her racing heart. She could not hear the words, but she could see the colonel's aggressive posture, could see the groundskeeper's preternatural stillness, could see something building between them that felt like the moment before lightning strikes. "Take off that shirt," Mercer demanded. His voice had risen again, drawing attention from nearby guests. "Show me your DD-214. Show me proof of anything you claim. Because I have been in this uniform for 30 years, and I know a fraud when I see one." Virgil's hand moved to his chest, not to the buttons of his shirt, but to the dog tags beneath. He pressed them against his sternum, feeling the familiar edges, the worn engravings, the weight of 2 lives reduced to stamped metal. "You want proof," he said. His voice was still quiet, but something had changed in it. A hardness, a precision. The voice of a man who had given orders in the dark while death closed in from every direction. Mercer hesitated. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The groundskeeper was no longer shrinking. The groundskeeper was no longer invisible. Something else was emerging from beneath the worn clothes and weathered skin. Something that made the colonel's instincts scream, warnings his conscious mind refused to acknowledge. "I want you gone," Mercer said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I want you off this property and out of my sight." Virgil reached up slowly and began to unbutton his work shirt. 1 button, 2, 3. The fabric parted to reveal a faded undershirt, worn thin with age, and beneath it the glint of metal. Dog tags, 2 sets, and on his right forearm, exposed for the first time in 11 years, a tattoo. Coordinates, a date, an eagle clutching a banner, 3 sets of initials arranged in a triangle. DR, MWTG. Behind the colonel, Sergeant Major Devane finally broke through the crowd and stumbled to a halt. His eyes found the tattoo, and the blood drained from his face. "Oh my God," he breathed. "It is him." Mercer turned at the sound, confusion replacing contempt. "What are you talking about? Who is him?" But Devane was not looking at the colonel. He was looking at the old man with the unbuttoned shirt and the exposed tattoo, and his hand was rising slowly to his brow in a salute that trembled with emotion. "Spectre," he whispered. The word carried across the suddenly silent garden like a prayer. "Sir, is an honor." And in that moment, everything changed. The silence that followed Devane's words spread across the memorial garden like ripples in still water. Guests who had been chatting near the refreshment tables fell quiet. Cadets who had been preparing for the formal march froze in place. Even the wind seemed to pause, the flag above the parade ground hanging limp for a single breathless moment. Colonel Mercer stood between the two men, his head swiveling from Devane to the groundskeeper and back again. His mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. "Spectre," he repeated. The word came out uncertain, stripped of its earlier contempt. "What is Spectre? What are you talking about?" Devane did not lower his salute. His eyes remained fixed on Virgil with an intensity that bordered on reverence. His voice, when he spoke, cracked on every other word. "Operation Phantom Strike," he said. January 1968. Quanti Hovin, a force recon team, was inserted behind enemy lines during the Tet Offensive. The extraction went wrong. 3 men died. 1 man carried all 3 of them through 2 miles of hostile jungle while wounded and under pursuit. He paused, swallowing hard. That man's call sign was Spectre, and I'm looking at him right now. Mercer's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been the first stirring of fear. He turned back to the groundskeeper, really looking at him for the first time. The worn clothes, the weathered skin, the eyes that held depths the colonel had never bothered to notice. "This is absurd," Mercer said, but his voice had lost its edge. "This man is a groundskeeper. He trims hedges. He cannot possibly be some kind of war hero." Virgil had not moved since Devane's salute. He stood with his shirt still open, the dog tags catching the afternoon light, the tattoo exposed on his forearm, like a confession written in ink and scar tissue. His eyes were fixed on something far away, something only he could see. I could walk away, he thought. Even now, I could button my shirt and pick up my shears and disappear around the corner of the administration building. I could be invisible again. I could be safe. But Danny's voice was in his head. The same voice that had haunted him for 56 years. The same voice that whispered to him every morning in the memorial garden. "You get them home, Spectre. Promise me." He had carried their bodies home, but he had never carried their memory into the light. He had buried it instead, buried it beneath 11 years of anonymity, beneath 56 years of silence, beneath the carefully constructed lie that he was no one, that he had done nothing, that the legend was just a story told by men who had never been there. Today was January 30th. Today was the anniversary. And standing in the shadow of a memorial wall covered with names of the fallen, Virgil Tate made a choice. He would not walk away. Not today. Not from this. Not anymore. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet. But it carried. It carried the way orders carry in the darkness when lives depend on every syllable. It carried the way truth carries when it has been buried too long and finally claws its way to the surface. 34.52 degrees north, he said. 106.87 degrees east. The coordinates hung in the air. Mercer's brow furrowed in confusion, but Devane's face went pale. He knew those numbers. Every Marine who had studied the Vietnam War knew those numbers. Quang Tri Province, Virgil continued. January 23rd, 1968. We inserted at 0300 hours. 5-man team. Myself as team leader. Corporal Danny Reeves on point. Corporal Marcus Webb, communications. Lance Corporal Thomas Garza, demolition. We were tasked with extracting a CIA intelligence officer who had been embedded with a North Vietnamese army unit for 7 months. His hand moved to the dog tags, lifting them from his chest so the metal caught the light. The mission was supposed to take 48 hours. It took 9 days. We covered 16 miles through hostile territory, moving only at night. On the 7th day, we reached the extraction point. He paused. The silence around him had become absolute. Cadets and donors and dignitaries had drifted closer, drawn by something they did not understand, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after the ceremony was forgotten. The extraction went wrong, Virgil said. His voice did not waver, but something in his eyes had shifted. The 1,000-yard stare had focused, sharpened, become something raw and immediate. We took fire from 3 directions. Marcus went down first. 3 rounds to the chest. He was 25 years old. He had a daughter back home he never met. Cadet Vasquez lowered her phone slightly, her hand trembling. She had wanted to capture this moment, but now she felt like an intruder, witnessing something too sacred for recording. Tomas was next, Virgil continued. 19 years old. A grenade landed near the intelligence officer. Tomas threw himself on it. It was a dud. The sniper round that found him 30 seconds later was not. A woman in the crowd made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Mercer had gone completely still, his face the color of old paper. Danny took the RPG that was meant for me, Virgil said. He saw it coming. He pushed me out of the way. The shrapnel tore through his vest, severed his femoral artery. He bled out in 90 seconds. The dog tags clinked softly as Virgil lifted them higher. These are his, he said. Danny Reeves. He gave them to me before he died. Told me to get them home. Told me to get all of them home. He let the tags fall back against his chest. I carried them. 2 miles through enemy jungle. Marcus on my left shoulder. Tomas on my right. Danny across my back. I carried them because I could not leave them. I carried them because leaving them would have meant that everything we did, everything we sacrificed, meant nothing. His eyes finally focused on Colonel Mercer. The colonel who had called him an embarrassment. The colonel who had demanded he remove himself from sight. The colonel who had spoken about sacrifice from a stage he had never earned the right to stand on. You ask me what gives me the right to stand here, Virgil said quietly. That is what gives me the right. Their blood, their sacrifice, their lives traded for mine. He reached down and picked up his shears from the grass at his feet. I have been trimming your hedges for 11 years, Colonel. I have been invisible because I wanted to be invisible, because the men who deserve recognition are carved into that wall behind you, and I am just the one who survived. He buttoned his shirt slowly, covering the tattoo, covering the dog tags, covering the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. But do not ever, he said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, tell me I do not belong here. Do not ever tell me I have not earned the right to stand on ground that I have watered with the memory of my brothers every single day for 11 years. The words hung in the January air, and Colonel Bradley Mercer, for the first time in his 30-year career, had absolutely nothing to say. The crowd had grown without Virgil noticing. What had begun as a confrontation witnessed by a handful of guests had become something else entirely. Word had spread through the VIP tent, across the parade ground, into the stands where parents sat with programs clutched in their hands. People had drifted toward the memorial garden in 2s and 3s, drawn by whispers and pointed fingers and the unmistakable electricity of something extraordinary happening. Now nearly 200 people stood in a rough semicircle around the old groundskeeper and the colonel who had tried to humiliate him. Phones were raised. Cameras were recording. The senator's chief of staff was speaking urgently into his cell phone. And at the center of it all, Colonel Bradley Mercer stood frozen, his world collapsing around him in real time. He tried to speak. His mouth opened, closed, open again. The words that had flowed so easily from the podium an hour earlier had abandoned him completely. He was a man who had built his career on the appearance of authority, and in the space of 5 minutes, that appearance had been stripped away like wallpaper from a condemned building. I did not know, he finally managed. His voice came out thin, reedy, nothing like the commanding baritone that had echoed across the parade ground. How could I have known? Virgil did not respond. He stood with his shears in one hand, his shirt buttoned again, the legend retreating back beneath the surface of the groundskeeper. He had said what needed to be said. He had spoken the truth that had been buried for 56 years. And now he wanted nothing more than to disappear again, to return to his roses and his silence and the comfortable invisibility that had protected him for so long. But the world had other plans. Sergeant Major Devane stepped forward, his salute finally lowering. His eyes were wet, his voice thick with emotion that he made no effort to hide. "Sir," he said to Virgil, "Master Gunnery Sergeant, I studied your operation at officer training school. Every Marine who went through Vietnam orientation studied what you did. You are not just a veteran. You are a legend. You are one of the most decorated force recon operators in the history of the Corps." Virgil shook his head slowly. "I am a groundskeeper," he said. "That is all I have been for 11 years. That is all I want to be." But the crowd was not listening. The crowd was reacting. A murmur had begun, swelling like a wave, as the scope of what they were witnessing became clear. An elderly woman near the front was openly weeping. A young cadet had snapped to attention, his hand rising to his brow in a salute that no one had ordered. Another followed, then another. Within 30 seconds, every cadet on the parade ground was at attention, saluting a man in a dirt-stained work shirt who had asked for nothing but to be left alone. Vasquez had lowered her phone. She stood at the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down her face, watching something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. The old man she had noticed during the national anthem. The old man whose bearing had seemed so familiar. The old man who had nodded back at her when no one else at the academy had acknowledged his existence in 11 years. He was a hero, a real one, not the kind who gave speeches and accepted awards and posed for photographs. The kind who carried his brothers through hell and then spent the next 5 decades pretending he had done nothing at all. The senator pushed through the crowd, his security detail struggling to keep up. He was a politician, trained to recognize moments of opportunity, and this was a moment unlike any he had encountered in 30 years of public life. "Sir," he said, extending his hand toward Virgil. "Senator Richard Callahan. I serve on the Armed Services Committee. I want you to know that what you did, what you sacrificed, it will not be forgotten. Not after today." Virgil looked at the extended hand. He did not take it. "With respect, Senator," he said quietly, "I did not do this for recognition. I did not tell this story so that people would shake my hand and call me a hero. I told it because a man who has never seen combat stood on a stage and lectured me about sacrifice. I told it because my brothers deserve to be remembered by someone other than me." He turned slightly, his eyes moving to the memorial wall behind him. The black granite, the carved names, the roses he had planted 11 years ago, red and white and yellow, blooming in silent testimony to men whose graves existed only in his memory. "Those are the heroes," he said, "the ones who did not come home, the ones who gave everything and asked for nothing. I'm just the one who carried them." The senator lowered his hand, chastened. Around him, the crowd had fallen silent again, hanging on every word from the old man who spoke with a quiet authority that made colonels and senators seem small. Colonel Mercer had not moved. He stood rooted to the spot, his face a mask of dawning horror as the full weight of what he had done settled onto his shoulders. He had mocked a living legend. He had demanded that a Silver Star recipient remove himself from sight. He had called a man who had carried 3 bodies through enemy jungle and embarrassment to military standards. His career was over. He knew it with the same certainty that he knew the sun would set. The phones recording this moment would ensure that every military academy, every promotion board, every commanding officer would know what Colonel Bradley Mercer had done on this January afternoon. But worse than the career implications, worse than the public humiliation, was the knowledge that he had been wrong. Completely, utterly, catastrophically wrong. He had spent 30 years judging men by the shine on their boots and the press of their uniforms, and he had never once considered that true service might wear dirt-stained clothes and weathered skin. "I am sorry," he whispered. The words came out broken, barely audible. "I am so sorry." Virgil turned back to face him. For a long moment, the 2 men stood in silence. The colonel who had built his life on appearances. The groundskeeper who had buried his legend beneath 11 years of invisibility. Then Virgil nodded. Once, a small movement that might have been acknowledgement, might have been forgiveness, might have been simply the recognition that some mistakes could not be unmade but could perhaps be learned from. He bent down and picked up the bucket of hedge trimmings he had abandoned hours earlier. "The ceremony is not over," he said. His voice had returned to its normal register, soft and hoarse and unremarkable. "You should get back to your guests, Colonel." And before anyone could respond, before the senator could offer another handshake, or the cadets could lower their salutes, or the cameras could capture another moment, Virgil Tate turned and walked away. He did not look back. The legend had spoken, and now the groundskeeper wanted to return to his roses. Virgil made it 17 steps before the voice stopped him. Master Gunnery Sergeant Tate. The words cut through the murmur of the crowd like a blade through silk. Not loud, not commanding, but carrying an authority that made every head turn toward its source. A man was pushing through the gathered crowd. He was in his early 70s, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Virgil's truck. But it was not the suit that made people step aside. It was the way he moved, the economy of motion, the predator's grace that decades of civilian life could not erase. Virgil stopped. His back was still turned, but something in his posture shifted, a tension that had not been there a moment before. The silver-haired man emerged from the crowd and stopped 10 feet away. His eyes were fixed on the groundskeeper's back with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged. "I know that walk," the man said. "I have been watching you move across this parade ground for the past hour, and I know that walk. I saw it in the jungles of Quang Tri. I saw it in the highlands of Khe San. I saw it every day for 3 years when I served as intelligence liaison to Force Recon." Virgil turned slowly. His face was unreadable, but his eyes had changed. The 1,000-yard stare had focused into something sharp and immediate. "Colonel Harrison," he said quietly. It was not a question. The silver-haired man smiled. A small, sad smile that held decades of memory. "It has been a long time, Spectre. I was not certain you were still alive. After you left the Corps, you disappeared completely. No forwarding address. No contact information. Just gone." The crowd had fallen silent again. Even the senator had stopped trying to manage the moment, recognizing that something was happening that transcended politics and photo opportunities. "I wanted to disappear," Virgil said. "I needed to." Harrison nodded slowly. "I understand. Believe me, I understand. After what you went through, after what you lost, no one would have blamed you for walking away from everything." He took a step closer, and his voice dropped so that only Virgil could hear. "But I need you to know something. What you did on that extraction, what you did for those men, it was not forgotten. It was never forgotten. Your operation became required study at Quantico. Your actions are taught to every Force Recon candidate as the definition of what it means to leave no man behind." Virgil's jaw tightened. "I left 3 men behind," he said. "In the ground. In boxes. I left them behind, and I have been carrying that weight every day since." Harrison shook his head. "You carry them home. That is not the same thing. That is the opposite of leaving them behind." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box. The crowd leaned forward collectively, sensing the significance of the moment. "I came here today to present an award during the ceremony," Harrison said. "A posthumous recognition for a young officer killed in Afghanistan. But I think that recognition can wait a few more minutes." He opened the box. Inside, resting on white satin, was a medal, gold and blue enamel, an anchor and an eagle, the Navy Cross. "This was supposed to be presented to you in 1969, Harrison said. "But the operation was classified. Your actions were classified. Everything about Phantom Strike was buried so deep that even your commendations had to wait." He lifted the medal from a box. "The classification was lifted in 1998. I have been trying to find you ever since. 26 years, Spectre. 26 years of searching for a ghost who did not want to be found." Virgil stared at the medal. His hands remained at his sides. His face remained impassive. But something behind his eyes was breaking, crumbling, falling away. "I did not deserve that," he said. His voice cracked on the words. "Danny deserved it. Marcus deserved it. Tomas deserved it. They were the ones who gave everything. I just survived." Harrison stepped forward and pressed the medal into Virgil's hand, closing the weathered fingers around it. "You survived because they needed you to survive," he said. "You survived because someone had to carry them home. You survived because that is what warriors do. They endure. They carry the weight. They keep moving forward even when every part of them wants to stop." He stepped back and snapped to attention. His hand rose to his brow in a salute that was crisp and perfect despite the decades since he had worn a uniform. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Virgil Tate," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "On behalf of the United States Marine Corps and a grateful nation, I present you with the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. Your actions on January 30th, 1968, reflect the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service." The date hit Virgil like a physical blow. January 30th. Today, the anniversary, the day he had carried them through the jungle. The day Danny had died in his arms. He looked down at the medal in his hand, gold and blue and cold against his palm. 56 years late. 56 years of silence and invisibility and the daily ritual of tending roses that no one else knew were graves. His vision blurred. For the first time in decades, tears spilled down Virgil Tate's weathered cheeks. Behind him, the crowd had begun to applaud. Not the polished applause that had followed the colonel's speech. Something raw, something real. The sound of people witnessing a moment of truth and responding with the only language they had. Cadets who were still at attention began to break ranks, moving forward. Donors who had come expecting champagne and tax deductions found themselves weeping openly. Parents held their children close, whispering explanations that would become family stories told for generations. And at the edge of the crowd, Sergeant Major Devane stood with his hands still raised in salute, tears streaming down his face, watching a legend finally receive the recognition that had been denied for more than half a century. Cadet Vasquez had stopped recording. Some moments, she realized, were not meant to be captured. Some moments were meant to be witnessed and carried forward in memory, the way Virgil had carried his brothers through the jungle all those years ago. The applause continued. The tears continued. And Virgil Tate stood in the center of it all, holding a medal he had never wanted, finally seen by a world he had spent 56 years hiding from. "Still here, brother," he whispered so quietly that no one else could hear. Still trying. And somewhere in the January wind, he could have sworn he heard Danny's voice whisper back, "I know, Spectre. I always knew." The applause faded slowly, like thunder rolling away across distant hills. Virgil stood motionless, the Navy Cross still clutched in his weathered hand, his eyes fixed on something beyond the crowd, beyond the parade ground, beyond the January sky. The tears had stopped, but their tracks remained on his cheeks, evidence of a dam that had finally broken after 56 years of holding. Colonel Harrison had stepped back, his salute lowered, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. He had spent 26 years searching for a ghost. Now that ghost stood before him, finally visible, finally acknowledged, finally given what should have been given decades ago. But the moment was not over. A commotion at the edge of the crowd drew attention. Voices raised, bodies shifting, someone pushing through with an urgency that disrupted the reverent stillness that had settled over the memorial garden. "Let me through." The voice was female, authoritative, accustomed to being obeyed. I said, "Let me through." Now, the crowd parted, and a woman emerged. She was in her mid-60s, silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing the dress uniform of a Marine Corps colonel. Her chest was heavy with ribbons, her bearing ramrod straight, her eyes locked on Virgil with an intensity that made everyone else fade into background noise. She stopped 5 feet from him. Her jaw was tight. Her hands were clenched at her sides. And when she spoke, her voice trembled with an emotion that her rigid posture could not contain. "Sergeant Major Tate," she said, "my name is Colonel Patricia Reeves Morrison." The name hit Virgil like a bullet. Reeves. His eyes snapped to her face, searching, finding. The shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, the way she held her shoulders when she was trying not to break. Danny's daughter. The daughter Marcus Webb had never met. The daughter who had been 3 days old when her father deployed. The daughter who had grown up with a folded flag and a photograph and stories of a father who had died a hero. "My mother told me about you," she said. Her voice cracked, but she did not look away. "She told me that a man named Spectre carried my father's body through 2 miles of jungle. She told me that you held him while he died, that you took his dog tags and promised to bring them home." Virgil's hand moved involuntarily to his chest, pressing against the metal beneath his shirt. Danny's tags, the ones he had worn for 56 years, the ones he had never been able to give up. She told me that you visited her once, Patricia continued. In 1969, after the funeral, you sat in her kitchen for 3 hours and you did not say a word. You just sat there, and when you left, she said she understood something she had not understood before. Her voice broke completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she remained at attention, a soldier delivering a report even as her heart shattered. She understood that my father was not alone when he died. She understood that someone was with him, holding him, carrying him forward. And she spent the rest of her life praying for the man who had done that, praying that he would find peace. Virgil's legs buckled. Sergeant Major Devane moved forward to catch him, but Virgil waved him off. He steadied himself, one hand pressed against his knee, breathing hard, fighting to remain upright as the weight of 56 years came crashing down. I cannot save him, he said. The words came out ragged, torn from somewhere deep. I tried. God, I tried. But the shrapnel hit the artery and there was nothing I could do. I held pressure until my hands cramped, but the blood kept coming, and he kept talking, and then he stopped, and I could not save him. He looked up at Patricia Reeves Morrison, Danny's daughter, the child who had grown up without a father because Virgil had not been fast enough, had not seen the RPG in time, had not been standing where he should have been standing. I am sorry, he whispered. I am so sorry. Patricia closed the distance between them in 3 steps. She did not salute. She did not extend a hand. She wrapped her arms around the old groundskeeper and held him the way her father never could. He talked about you in his letters, she said into his shoulder. He said you were the best team leader he ever served with. He said you would die for any of them without hesitation. He said serving with Spectre was the honor of his life. She pulled back, her hands gripping his shoulders, her eyes locked on his. You did not fail him, she said. You honored him. Every day, for 56 years, you have honored him. And my mother knew it. She knew it until the day she died. And now I know it too. Virgil stared at her. Danny's eyes stared back. The same fierce determination. The same unbreakable will. The same capacity for grace that had made Danny the best point man Virgil had ever known. He reached beneath his shirt and pulled out the dog tags. Both sets. His own, worn and scratched, and Danny's, still dark with stains that might have been blood or might have been 56 years of being pressed against a breaking heart. His hand shook as he lifted Danny's tags over his head. The chain caught on his collar. He fumbled with it, his fingers clumsy with age and emotion. Finally, the tags came free. He held them out to Patricia. I promised him, he said. I promised I would bring them home. But I did not know where home was anymore. I did not know who to give them to. So I kept them. I kept them close because it was the only way I knew to keep him close. Patricia took the tags. The metal was warm from his skin, worn smooth from decades of being touched in the dark. She pressed them to her lips, then to her heart. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for carrying him. Thank you for remembering him. Thank you for keeping him alive all these years when no one else could. The crowd had gone absolutely silent. 200 people stood witness to a moment that transcended ceremony, transcended recognition, transcended everything they thought they understood about sacrifice and grief and the bonds that connect those who serve. Colonel Harrison wiped tears from his eyes. Sergeant Major Devane had given up any pretense of military bearing and was openly weeping. Cadet Vasquez stood with her hand over her mouth, understanding finally what it meant to leave no man behind. And at the edge of the crowd, Colonel Bradley Mercer watched the daughter of a fallen hero embrace the man he had tried to humiliate, and something inside him broke that would never be repaired. Virgil Tate had carried Danny Reeves for 56 years. Now, finally, he had brought him home. The ceremony that followed was nothing like the one Colonel Mercer had planned. There were no more speeches about sacrifice for men who had never bled. There were no more rehearsed pauses or manufactured voice cracks. Instead, there was silence, reverent, sacred silence, as the crowd processed what they had witnessed. The commandant of Harrington Military Academy, A retired two-star general named Foster had emerged from the VIP tent during Patricia's embrace. He had stood at the edge of the crowd, watching, listening, understanding. Now he stepped forward, his bearing grave, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Tate," he said, "on behalf of Harrington Military Academy, I owe you an apology. For 11 years, you have served this institution with dedication and honor. And for 11 years, we failed to see you. We failed to recognize what was standing right in front of us." Virgil shook his head slightly. "I did not want to be recognized, sir. I wanted to be invisible. That is not your failure. That was my choice." Foster nodded slowly. "Perhaps. But what happened today, the way you were treated by a representative of this academy, that was unacceptable. And there will be consequences." He turned his gaze to Colonel Mercer, who stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. The colonel's face had gone gray. His hands hung limp at his sides. The polished confidence that had carried him through 30 years of military pageantry had evaporated, leaving behind something hollow and broken. "Colonel Mercer," Foster said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the force of a tribunal. "You will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning. You will bring your resignation letter, and you will pray that the men and women who witnessed your conduct today find it in their hearts to forget what they saw." Mercer opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Sir," he managed, "I did not know. How could I possibly have known?" Foster's expression did not change. "That is precisely the point, Colonel. You did not know. You looked at a man, and you saw dirt on his clothes instead of the weight on his shoulders. You saw worn boots instead of the miles they had walked. You saw a groundskeeper instead of a warrior." He stepped closer to Mercer, lowering his voice so that only those nearest could hear. "You gave a speech today about sacrifice. You used words like honor and duty and the warrior spirit. And then you tried to remove from this ceremony a man who embodies those words more completely than you ever will. That is not ignorance, Colonel. That is a failure of character." Mercer's knees buckled. He caught himself on the arm of a nearby cadet, who stepped back instinctively, leaving the colonel to stumble before regaining his balance. The crowd watched in silence. There was no satisfaction in Mercer's humiliation, no pleasure in watching a man's career disintegrate. Only the grim recognition that actions have consequences and that some mistakes cannot be unmade. Virgil watched too. He felt no vindication, no triumph, only the exhaustion of a man who had been invisible for so long that visibility itself was a kind of violence. Patricia Reeves Morrison still stood beside him, her father's dog tags clutched in her hand. She had not moved since the embrace, had not spoken. She seemed to understand that Virgil needed silence the way drowning men need air. Senator Callahan stepped forward, his political instincts finally catching up with the moment. He addressed the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had given 10,000 speeches. "What we witnessed here today," he said, "is a reminder of something we too often forget. The men and women who serve our nation do not always wear their service on their sleeves. They do not always stand on stages or accept applause. Sometimes they trim hedges. Sometimes they drive buses. Sometimes they sit on street corners with cardboard signs, asking for nothing, remembering everything." He turned to Virgil. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Tate, on behalf of the United States Senate, I want you to know that your service will be entered into the congressional record. Your name will be spoken on the floor of the Senate. And if there is anything at all that I can do to honor your sacrifice, you have only to ask." Virgil looked at the senator, then at Colonel Harrison, then at Patricia, who held her father's tags like a lifeline. "There's one thing," he said quietly. "Name it," the senator replied. Virgil turned and pointed to the memorial wall behind him. The black granite, the carved names, the roses he had planted 11 years ago. "There are 3 names missing from that wall," he said. "Corporal Danny Reeves, Corporal Marcus Webb, Lance Corporal Thomas Garza. They did not graduate from this academy. They never walked these grounds as cadets, but they died so that others could. They deserve to be remembered here." The senator nodded slowly. "Done," he said. "I will personally ensure that their names are added to this memorial. It will be my honor." Virgil exhaled, a sound that might have been relief, might have been release. Might have been the first breath of a man who had been holding his breath for 56 years. "Thank you," he said. "That is all I wanted. That is all I ever wanted." Patricia took his hand. Her grip was strong, warm, alive. So different from the cold metal of dog tags. So different from the weight of the dead. "Come with me," she said softly. "My mother's grave is in Arlington. I visit every year on this day. I think she would want to meet the man who kept her husband's memory alive." Virgil stared at her. Arlington, the white headstones in perfect rows. The weight of a nation's sacrifice pressed into manicured grass. He had not been to Arlington since 1969, since the funeral, since he had stood at the edge of Danny's grave and made a promise he did not know how to keep. "I do not know if I can," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. Patricia squeezed his hand. "You carried them for 56 years," she said. "Let me help you carry them now." The words hung in the January air, and something in Virgil Tate, something that had been locked away since a jungle clearing in 1968, finally began to open. He nodded. Once. A small movement that held the weight of decades. "Okay," he said. "Okay." And for the first time in 56 years, he let someone else help him carry the dead. 6 weeks later, the roses began to bloom. Virgil knelt in the memorial garden as he had knelt every morning for 11 years, his hands working the soil around the bushes he had planted in memory of men whose names were finally carved in stone. The new plaque had been installed the previous week. Black granite, matching the wall. 3 names in gold leaf. Corporal Danny Reeves. Corporal Marcus Webb. Lance Corporal Thomas Garza. Operation Phantom Strike. January 30th, 1968. Leave no man behind. He touched the letters with dirt-stained fingers. The same fingers that had held pressure on wounds that cannot be held. The same fingers that had gripped dog tags in the darkness of a jungle that existed now only in memory. "Morning, boys," he said softly. "Got you on the wall. Took 56 years, but you made it. You're home now. Really home." The sun climbed higher over the Virginia hills, painting the campus in shades of gold and amber. Behind him, the sounds of the academy coming to life drifted across the parade ground. Cadets jogging in formation. Instructors calling commands. The rhythms of military life continuing as they always had, as they always would. But everything was different now. The video had gone viral within hours of the ceremony. Cadet Vasquez's footage, the part she had recorded before she stopped, had been uploaded and shared and viewed millions of times. The story of the groundskeeper and the colonel had spread across news networks and social media platforms, sparking conversations about how society treats its veterans, about the invisible heroes who walk among us, about the cost of service that does not end when the uniform comes off. Virgil had refused every interview request, had declined every invitation to speak, had turned down offers from publishers and documentary filmmakers and politicians who wanted to attach themselves to his story. He did not want fame. He did not want recognition. He had wanted 3 names on a wall, and now those names were there, and that was enough. But some things had changed whether he wanted them to or not. The cadets saw him now. When he walked across the parade ground with his wheelbarrow, they nodded. When he trimmed the hedges near the dormitories, they said good morning. Some of them had taken to leaving small gifts at the memorial garden. Challenge coins, handwritten notes, a photograph of a grandfather who had served in Korea, placed beneath the new plaque with a stone to hold it down. He did not know what to do with their attention. After 11 years of invisibility, being seen felt like standing naked in a spotlight. But he was learning. Slowly. Painfully. He was learning that being seen did not have to mean being consumed. Patricia visited every Sunday. She would arrive mid-morning, parking her silver sedan in the visitor lot, walking across the grounds in civilian clothes that made her look smaller than she had in uniform. They would sit together on the bench near the roses, watching the cadets march past, speaking little, needing less. She told them about her mother, about the years of waiting for a knock on the door that never came, about the folded flag and the empty chair at every holiday table, about growing up in the shadow of a hero she had never known. And Virgil told her about Danny, about the way he had laughed at the worst possible moments, about his terrible poker face and his perfect instincts under fire. about the night in Saigon when Danny had talked him back from the edge, when the weight of command had nearly crushed him, when he had considered eating his service pistol and ending the pain. "Your father saved my life," he told her. Not just in that clearing. Long before. Many times. I owed him a debt I could never repay. Patricia had taken his hand. "You paid it," she said. "Every day for 56 years. You paid it in full." He was not certain she was right. He might never be certain. But he was learning to accept the possibility that she might not be wrong. The therapy sessions had started 3 weeks ago. Patricia had arranged them. A VA counselor who specialized in combat trauma, who had worked with veterans for 30 years, who did not flinch at the things Virgil described in his halting, broken voice. It was harder than anything he had ever done. Harder than the extraction. Harder than the carrying. Harder than the 56 years of silence. Speaking the memories aloud gave them a power they had not possessed when they lived only in his head, but also took something from them, made them smaller, made them survivable in a way they had never been before. He still woke with nightmares, still heard the rotors and the gunfire and Danny's last words when the wind blew a certain way, still carried the weight that would never fully lift. But he was learning that carrying did not have to mean carrying alone. Footsteps approached on the gravel path. Virgil looked up to see Cadet Vasquez walking toward him, her uniform pressed, her bearing crisp. "Master Gunnery Sergeant," she said, "may I join you?" He nodded and shifted slightly on the bench, making room. She sat beside him in silence for a long moment, looking at the roses, at the new plaque, at the names that had finally found their place among the honored dead. "I graduate in 4 months," she said finally. "I received my orders last week. Officer candidate school, then infantry training, then deployment." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I am scared," she admitted. "I have trained for this my entire life, but now that it is real, I do not know if I am ready. I do not know if I have what it takes." Virgil considered her words. He remembered being young, remembered the certainty that had carried him into the jungle and the doubt that had carried him out. Remembered the gap between who he thought he was and who the war revealed him to be. "Nobody is ready," he said finally. "The ones who think they are ready are the most dangerous." Fear is not weakness. Fear is wisdom. It means you understand what you are walking into. He looked at the plaque, at the names of men who had been young once, who had been scared once, who had walked into the darkness anyway because that was what the mission required. "Being brave does not mean not being afraid," he said. "It means being afraid and doing it anyway. It means carrying the weight even when it breaks you. It means coming home different than you left and finding a way to live with what you have become." Vasquez was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For what you did then. For what you're doing now. For letting us see you." Virgil looked at her, at the young face full of determination and doubt, at the future she was walking toward, full of horrors and honors she could not yet imagine. "Just come home," he said. "Whatever else happens, you come home. And if you cannot come home whole, you come home anyway. The rest, we figure out together." She stood, saluted, and walked away across the parade ground. He watched her go, remembering Danny at that age, remembering himself at that age, remembering all the young faces that had walked into jungles and deserts and never walked out. The roses swayed in the morning breeze. Red for courage, white for sacrifice, yellow for remembrance. 11 years of tending, 56 years of carrying. A lifetime of learning to live with the weight. Virgil Tate rose from the bench and picked up his shears. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But now the work meant something different. Now the work was not hiding. Now the work was honoring. "Still here, brothers," he whispered to the names on the wall. "Still trying. And now, finally not alone. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in places we least expect, please subscribe to our channel. And share in the comments who is the quiet hero in your life that deserves recognition. Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones still in uniform. Sometimes they are trimming hedges and tending roses and carrying the weight of sacrifice that the rest of us will never understand. Thank you for watching. The sun rose higher. The campus came alive. And in the memorial garden of Harrington Military Academy, an old groundskeeper tended roses that had finally begun to bloom.